This is the most absurd, on its face, obvious corruption that I think I've ever seen in terms of a judicial proceeding. I mean, you would have to point me to another example. You would have to prove me wrong that there is another example of a judge telling a jury that they don't actually need to follow the law in order to convict a defendant of a crime, that they don't actually have to find an underlying crime upon which the crime charged against their defendant depends in order to convict the defendant of that crime. It is so insane that these are the instructions that were given to this jury. And if they come back with a conviction, this is prima facie illegitimate. Crazy breaking news on this, what is it, Wednesday? I think it's Wednesday. Wednesday, March 29th. So the judge in the Trump trial tells jurors they don't need to agree on crimes to convict. That's the headline over at Alpha News. And this is truly astounding. This has to do with the New York trial involving Stormy Daniels and alleged payments to pay her off in order to keep her silent regarding an alleged affair with President Donald Trump, who at the time was candidate Donald Trump in 2016. And this is astounding. Now, if you've been following this case at all, then you're aware of the fact that the prosecution's case has completely fallen apart on objective terms. They have not been able to identify an underlying crime that would actually elevate the conspiracy to conceal information by paying off Stormy Daniels to a felony. As you know, if you've been following this case at all, the misdemeanor crime that allegedly was engaged in by Donald Trump is past its statute of limitations, and in order to manufacture this lawfare against the former president and current presidential candidate, they try to resurrect the misdemeanor charge as a felony, reinvigorating it by tying it to an underlying crime, but they've never been able to demonstrate what that crime is. They kind of present this vague notion of election interference. And you would do that, according to the president of the Minnesota State Senate, Bobby Joe Champion, by establishing it in a court of law. Just as an aside, you'll recall that the ethics hearing against Senator Nicole Mitchell, who was arrested and charged with the first-degree burglary of her own mother, that resulted in an ethics complaint against the senator for violating Senate rules, which require members to uphold the highest ethical standards, which, being arrested and charged with first-degree burglary kind of strikes most normal, rational people as not upholding the highest ethical standards. In the ethics committee hearing presided over by Bobby Joe Champion, he put forward the notion that we can't possibly know any of the facts relevant to whether or not the Senate's rules were violated until they've been adjudicated in the pending criminal case against Senator Nicole Mitchell. Now, if you're going to copy and paste that logic to this case against Donald Trump, then you cannot argue that he's guilty of a felony tied to the interference with the election having something to do with payoffs to Stormy Daniels if you haven't first convicted him of having engaged in some underlying crime related to election interference, which simply has not happened. It hasn't happened. And so, and the difference, I want to say, because this isn't just whataboutism, the difference between what Bobby Joe Champion is saying and what I'm saying, Bobby Joe Champion's claim is completely absurd. We don't need to, for the purposes of an internal Senate investigation into whether or not a member has violated the code of ethics by failing to uphold the highest ethical standards, we do not need to engage in precisely the same fact-finding process as a criminal trial, which has the consequence of her losing her freedom, of her being incarcerated. There's a much lower standard of evidence for finding the fact that she engaged in behavior that did not uphold the highest standard of ethical conduct and therefore violates Senate rules and therefore makes her unfit to continue in the Senate. Bobby Joe Champion decided to conflate those things and let her get away with being who she is and having done what she did. In this case, if you are in a court of law, like this actually is a court proceeding, a civil court proceeding, a criminal court proceeding, and so you do have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this crime actually occurred. Like this is the exact opposite of the scenario of the Nicole Mitchell situation, where you're dealing with an actual criminal case, where the actual standard is you must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime occurred. And if the crime that you're prosecuting relies upon the previous determination of an underlying crime which has not been determined, then your client, your defendant, is innocent. Just de facto. Like, this case should have been dismissed. It's an absurd case. And yet, here's the latest from Alpha News. Several legal experts have raised questions about Judge Juan Merchan's instructions to the jury in former President Donald Trump's business records falsification trial in New York, with some suggesting the instructions were prejudiced towards a guilty verdict because the judge told jurors that they don't have to agree on the crimes the former president allegedly committed in order to convict. Judge Merchan's jury instructions could prove crucial in the case, in which the former president is accused of falsifying business records to conceal non-disclosure payments to a former adult film actress, because even small nuances in the instructions can make a big difference when a jury weighs whether to find President Trump guilty. In a Manhattan courtroom on May 29th, Judge Merchan instructed jurors about a key aspect of the case, namely the underlying crime of conspiracy to promote or prevent an election by unlawful means that elevates the misdemeanor of business records falsification to a felony. The judge told jurors that prosecutors must persuade them on two aspects of the count of falsifying business records in the first degree in order for them to convict. One is that President Trump personally or by acting in concert with another person or persons made or caused a false entry in the records of a business, and two, that the former president did so with the intent to commit or conceal another crime. If you find that people have proved beyond a reasonable doubt each of those two elements, you must find the defendant guilty of this crime, he said. However, even though the judge said that the jury must be unanimous on the two elements, he told them that they don't need to agree on some alleged underlying crimes that allowed the charges to be elevated to a felony. Although you must conclude unanimously that the defendant conspired to promote or prevent the election of any person to a public office by unlawful means, you need not be unanimous as to what those unlawful means were, the judge said. So what the judge is saying here is that you don't have to be able to point to an actual provable crime, like a proven crime that actually occurred. You don't have to agree that an actual underlying crime of a particular nature has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt in order to convict the president on a charge that relies entirely upon the premise that he was acting to conceal an underlying crime. This is the most absurd, on its face, obvious corruption that I think I've ever seen in terms of a judicial proceeding. I mean, you would have to point me to another example. You would have to prove me wrong that there is another example of a judge telling a jury that they don't actually need to follow the law in order to convict a defendant of a crime, that they don't actually have to find an underlying crime upon which the crime charged against their defendant depends in order to convict the defendant of that crime. It is so insane that these are the instructions that were given to this jury. And if they come back with a conviction, this is prima facie illegitimate. Like, there's no legitimacy to this proceeding whatsoever, and certainly an appeals court would have to find, and the Supreme Court, if it went that high, would have to find that these proceedings are absolutely out of order, and this judge should be removed. He should not be. He is obviously incompetent. He is obviously corrupt, or both, and has no business presiding over the lives of actual human beings. I mean, this is a responsibility that's way too important to entrust to somebody who would be willing to do something like this. So a couple of days ago, I saw this tweet. This comes from Wayne Root. He speaks to a Grayson Murray, who apparently is a golfer. I don't follow golf. I don't follow professional sports generally, but Grayson Murray is apparently a professional golfer who tragically took his own life. And I don't know the details of why this happened or how it happened, but I do find it interesting that this comment here by Wayne Root. He says, "Tragic, rest in peace. but we have to ask what's wrong with society. I've never heard of a successful pro golfer committing suicide. They have the greatest life in the world, blessed by God, all the money, most beautiful wives, treated like rock stars. Society is rotting at its core. And listen, society does have pretty big problems, and I think at the root of those problems, and potentially contributing to this tragic decision by Grayson Murray, is the question of purpose. And that's what I tweeted in reply. The question of purpose remains the highest of all. It doesn't matter how much you have materially. It doesn't matter what type of success you have enjoyed and by what metric, whether it's in the realm of finance or personal relationships, or various forms of achievement or conquest, however that's measured. At the end of the day, it all has to mean something, right? Like there has to be an underlying purpose to it. It has to be to the glory of something higher than yourself. And if it isn't, then you're going to live a life of despair. And I think that it goes without question that we're seeing a lot of despair in our current society. I was listening to another popular podcast today while I was out mowing the lawn, and I was hearing about this concept of so-called optimistic nihilism. And it's this weird little niche that is popping up where you have people who are embracing nihilism as some sort of net positive. They're saying, nothing matters. We're all just accidents of nature. We're all just evolutionary blips of no real significance. And because nothing matters, we should feel good about that, because that means that we can do whatever we want. We can be whatever we want. We can project whatever we want. And there are no rules because nothing really matters. And that's, of course, an absurd notion. You cannot, it is impossible to find any sort of happiness. Happiness is not just pleasure. It's not just momentary hedonistic joy. Happiness is persistent. Happiness endures. Happiness is a condition, much like its opposite, depression, right? It's something that persists and endures, and it is the product of meeting your values where they're at, like living up to your values and experiencing a life that is in alignment with your values. That is what generates happiness. And there is no need for that to manifest as being rich or being famous or being particularly successful in any particular endeavor. It can mean those things. Those things can contribute to it. But even if you have all those things, as Grayson Murray apparently did, it doesn't guarantee happiness unless you are aligned with a higher purpose that actually provides a context into which those achievements have meaning. And so we should reject nihilism as a concept. I fundamentally think that nihilism is at the root of the left. It's at the root of everything that the left is promoting. The idea that the only meaning in life is found in self, because that's really what's being sold under the brand of nihilism, is that you are your own meaning. And, like all lies, the reason why it's effective is because it has an echo of truth to it. Like, there is truth to the fact that you must define what is of value to you. That's what Ayn Rand had right. That you are the one who must define what is of value to you and then pursue that. But what she also said is that what you seek value in must have some sort of objective root to it. Like, it can't just be a whim. It can't be hedonism. It has to be something that has substance to it onto itself, that has inherent value. And your happiness is going to be derived by aligning your expectation and your values with that unchanging inherent aspect of reality. And of course, biblical worldview is very similar in that respect, where it says you can find liberty not in the capacity to do whatever you want, but in the alignment of your desire with the will of God. Because if your desire aligns with the will of God, then what you want will be what He wants, and then you will be free to do that. And not just free to do that in this kind of authoritarian sense of He's in charge, although He is, but free to do it in the sense that what he wants is good for you, what he wants works. It's kind of like, when I'm dealing with my kids, if I left my 10-year-old to himself, it would be cookies and M&Ms all day long. That might be what he wants, but that's not what's good for him. So to the extent that he aligns his desires with mine, which is that you're going to live healthfully, he will find liberty not just in being able to do what he wants, which is to live healthfully, but also in being able to live healthy, in being able to live longer, in being able to enjoy his quality of life as a consequence of making healthy decisions. That's kind of the way it works with believers and God, and it's also the way it works just with human beings and reality as such, because it turns out those two things are actually the same thing. God created reality, and therefore, if you live in accordance with what he created, you're going to have a healthy life. It's amazing how that works. A school counselor in Buncombe County Schools, I'm pretty sure I am not pronouncing that correctly, in North Carolina, is alarmed about a trend where students say their pronouns are U.S.A. She thinks this trend is highly offensive and seeks advice on how to deal with it. She does not like the fact that her students are going around saying that their pronouns are U.S.A. And it's interesting what she says. She says, this is quite offensive to those who are non-binary and who do not identify with the typical he, she. I've heard at least 10 students say this today. What can we do to address this? And this is kind of where I would start with this is, you say it's offensive to non-binary students. Who cares? I say that sincerely. Who cares? You obviously care, but my question is why? Why do you care what they find offensive as opposed to your other students who are saying their pronouns are USA? I thought the whole point of this exercise was to affirm whatever people said. I thought the whole point of this exercise was to affirm people's identity and to affirm how they identify, regardless of what our personal truths may be. I thought that was the point. And so what if by seeking to, quote-unquote, do something to address your students who are saying their pronouns are USA, what if what you're actually achieving is offending them? Like, does that matter? Does it matter whether those students are offended? Or does it only matter whether certain students are offended? And I think we all know the answer. Our last topic for today comes from James Lindsay, who is someone I deeply respect and admire, and this is something he's put out a couple of times in recent weeks. It's a graph showing the relationship between energy production and income per capita, GDP per capita. So on the left-hand side, the vertical side of the graph shows electricity consumption per capita, and on the horizontal axis, it shows GDP per capita. And as you can see, and it lists all the different nations, as you can see, the conclusion is there's no such thing as a low-energy rich country. And this should not come as a surprise to anyone. And it's one of the sources of my greatest frustration, certainly as a legislator here in Minnesota, having endured the passage and signing of the blackout bill, which mandates that we're going to be, quote-unquote, carbon-free 100% by 2040, a goal that's completely outside the realm of feasibility because currently 70% of our energy production comes from all the sources that are going to be banned under that provision, and there is no rational, achievable, feasible plan to somehow wean us off of those abundant, reliable, affordable sources of energy. And so we are headed to the lower right quadrant of this graph, which is a place where we have low energy and therefore are not rich as a state. And it's astounding to me that this is a conversation that moderately educated people have to have. I'm pretty sure I could go to my 10-year-old and without any sort of bias whatsoever, just by asking Socratic questions, I could fish out of him the notion that in order to make things, you have to have energy. And it turns out that's what wealth is. Wealth is nothing more than the frozen form of activity. That's what it is. It's excess, surplus activity, frozen in a form that can be utilized later. That's what wealth is. That's what property is. That's why, by the way, you properly ought to be able to use the same level of force to defend your property as you use to defend yourself, your person. Because when somebody assaults your property, they are assaulting the frozen form of your disposal of yourself. So you committed yourself to the production of that property, and that property stands in as a part of you, a surplus part of your activity that you own as much as you own your own body. And so when someone assails that property, they are assailing you. We do not have in the current modern 21st century Western world a healthy and objective and accurate view of the value of property. So it goes without saying that we also don't have an objective and healthy and accurate view of the value of energy and what it actually is and what it actually translates to. Energy is your capacity for activity, and activity is your capacity for life. And the more of it you have, the more leftover activity and energy you will be able to preserve in the form of wealth, in the form of property. And that's what this graph demonstrates. And it's so to the extent that the green movement, the movement towards environmentalism, to the extent, listen, we should all be concerned about our environment. Why? Because we live in it, because it is of value to us, because a healthy, clean environment furthers the capacity of human beings to live their life in healthful manners. That's why we should care about it. But if our solution to quote-unquote environmental problems is to deprive ourselves of the means to sustain ourselves, which is what energy is, then there's no point. Like, what is the point of saving the earth if we die as a result of our efforts to save it, right? What is the point of saving the earth if we end up poor and incapable of thriving and persisting? And the fact that this is an argument that even needs to be had continues to be a source of, well, let's just say it's confounding. I don't understand why this is an argument. You would think that people who enjoy the day-to-day pleasure of being able to live a healthful, modern life that transcends the quality of life afforded to kings and emperors in previous generations, you would think that that would foster some degree of gratitude and humility regarding how we got here and how we can maintain it. But that's clearly not a priority for a lot of folks, especially those who are on the left. Hey, thanks for listening. Appreciate you joining us on today's deep dive. I guess that's what I'm calling these things, these daily check-ins. Check back, like, subscribe, share. Appreciate you being part of the process.